Cash in the Cash. Written and narrated by ButterflyCoffee and produced for audio by Mr. Judge. What the hell have they done, mate?
I told him, Bill. I told him.
This engine can't make this load. She can't do it.
She's gonna have to, I'm afraid.
But she's underpowered. Lizzie stood grumpily seething as the driver and fireman argued beside her on the platform. Every word spoken between them made her crosser and crosser. It wasn't as if she had a say in the matter either. Now that war really was in full swing, the railway was almost solely responsible for ferrying supplies to and from wherever they were needed. It was back-breaking work for the crews, who sometimes had 20-hour shifts, and tiring too for the engines, some of whom were thrashed so hard that everyday necessities like coal and water became God-sent gifts. Even a red signal was welcomed as a breather before continuing the toil. It seemed, to the engines and the crews, as though the country was running more on bodged jobs and less on proper maintenance. But with this work, every man and machine had to be pushed to the ragged edge, with management going as far as to assign engines work for which they were not designed. This was the case for Lizzie today. Great Western engines were given a number of forms of categorising, one of them being power and weight. Shown by a coloured disc with a letter on the side of the cab, this told drivers where their engine could run and what they were capable of pulling given how much force they could safely put onto the rails. Lizzie had a blue disc with a D, meaning she was much stronger than Louise, but not as strong as Hercule. She could not run on most branch lines, and on other lines her speed was reduced, but she was more than capable of hard and fast mainline work. Lizzie had just been assigned to haul an ammunition goods, and her crew were realising that their engine was vastly underpowered.
I told you once and I'll tell you again and again. This load is for an E-class or more, not a Class D. We've got like half the power that we need.
Go to Mr. Turner and say he's done us over. We need a different engine, said the fireman.
I haven't a clue as to what makes you think you can find us another one in 5 minutes,
grumbled the driver, but he walked off regardless. Lizzie sat there and let off steam. She was hurt that these two thought she couldn't do the job. She'd been through a lot worse and came out all right. If she survived one war, she could bloody well survive the other one, given she wasn't out on the Western Front. Should be no trouble. The driver stomped back to his engine, shaking his head.
No good,
he told the fireman.
No more engines and we've got to leave now if we don't want to miss our path.
Sobbing management screwing us over. May as well give us a coffee pot for goodness sake. The two men got into the cab and grimly took their places at the controls. Lizzie gave a hoot of her whistle and set off. The 4300 growled furiously as she strained against the coupling, her wheels threatening to slip and give off sparks. Not even the work up at Bromsgrove was this difficult. That seemed little more than a walk through the park. She could hear the driver grumbling loudly in the cab, and it made her try even harder. This hard-faced old sot would not get away with speaking about her like this. She'd show him. She'd show him. With a great billow of steam from her cylinders and several assertive barks, she slowly pulled away. This old girl was going to have a run to remember. The pace set was an agonising crawl all along the main line. Lizzie did her best, but could not manage any more than 12 miles an hour. 12 miles an hour, more than nothing, she thought grimly to herself. The Great Western Mogul could feel her steam pressure rising higher, and, knowing that her fireman was going like the clappers, responded with a will, giving it all she had. She saw other engines flying by, throwing steam, flecks of ballast and soot in her face, and grimaced. On any other occasion, she would have roared and yelled until she was miles past them. But today, she had no breath to spare. Every single ounce of weight and steam was thrown into keeping this ammunitions train moving. Lizzie was not going to bloody stop until this train was where it should be. So onward she trundled, past Top Ness, and further upward still, into the depths of the county. At long, long last, Lizzie stopped. She didn't know where in Brunel's name she was, but to be quite honest, she did not care. She was far too glad of a rest to take any notice. 3 smart blasts of her whistle were sounded, and the distant call of 2 more engines came from behind. It was only then that the 4300 realised what was going on. She'd stopped at the bottom of a gradient, and her fireman was whistling for a banker to come and help them up. Lizzie was grateful. The good Lord above knows she'd never be able to manage on her own. The bankers buffered up, and more whistles were exchanged. Lizzie drew in a big breath and heaved forward. Great black columns of smoke and steam towered high above all the locomotives as they began to ascend. Lizzie was determined to prove she was capable of going above and beyond, and by God she would do it. Coffee pot indeed. If the journey up the main line was agonising, then this long climb was just unbearable. If Lizzie had ever been the flighty type of engine like Louise, or even an engine that was a little more vocal, she very well would have whined and groaned and complained the whole way up, begging and pleading to stop and crying out how everything hurt. It hurt so much. The mogul never felt like a climb would actually hurt, but it did. She felt stretched and stiff, and her axle boxes burnt, and her frames were on the verge of giving way. If only she was younger, if only she was fitter, if only there was no war, if only proper damn maintenance was being carried out. Lizzie could do nothing but grit her teeth and continue to climb higher up the gradient. She needed to get to the top. She had to! And she did. The 4300 finally got to the top of the hill. But now she had to get down, and her crew were very aware of what would happen next. On a typical long goods train, each wagon's brakes can be applied from the cab to slow them down when the locomotive descends a gradient. It's known as a fitted train, and it massively helps in preventing an engine losing control. But this was an unfitted train, so no such action could be taken. Brakes were applied manually by shunters on the line side. Lizzie had handled unfitted trains before, but usually when she was in better shape with a lighter load. This, however, was an ammunitions train, so the crew was not allowed to pin the brakes down at all in fear of sparks. Lizzie's driver and fireman were basically handling a locomotive that was grossly underpowered for this load and not properly maintained. And worst of all, the only braking power available was Lizzie herself and the brake van. They were going to lose control badly. The effects of gravity were immediate. Lizzie had crested the top and was now thundering down the line with almost 3,000 tons against her and little chance of stopping safely. The mogul screamed as she plummeted. The whistle kept blasting over the top of her, the crew frantically signalling to anyone who could hear that they were unable to stop. Down the train came and flew past the signal box. It was all the driver, fireman and guard could do to keep those brakes applied as Lizzie desperately tried to remain upright. On and on they flew through the next station, whistle still wailing and brakes still squealing. The 4300 kept seeing visions flashing in her mind as the boiler temperature kept tumbling. Cargo ferries, twisted rails submerged in mud, the wounded, the dead, gas clouds, aeroplanes, tanks, everything came flooding back. This was it. She was gonna die. Another station flashed by, but not so fast. Was she slowing down? Not by much, but she was. She was definitely slowing down. If that was the case, she was not going to die today. Lizzie threw herself against the load and her brakes were reapplied. The rocketing speed gradually slowed to an express engine cruising, and that gave way to a smart pace. Down to regular speed. Now a crawl. At last, Lizzie stopped. No one said a thing over the blasting of steam. They all stood stock still, attempting to regain their composure after such a close call with catastrophe. Every mind was still whirling with the rush of adrenaline as they processed exactly what had happened. Lizzie suddenly began coughing. Something must have gone into her smoke box or her tubes. Now the mogul could no longer breathe without difficulty. At last, she settled down enough to speak. Is everyone okay? That quiet, raspy wheeze didn't belong to her, did it?
I should say so,
replied her driver, sounding very wobbly himself. He tottered over and leaned out of the cab, looking for anything that could tell him where on earth he was. Great fields of flat green grass fanned out to either side of the main line, with great oak trees occasionally dotting the horizon and hedgerows. The light haze of dusk obscured what could have been further back. Other than that, they were completely deserted.
Where on earth are we then?
The driver numbly asked. The fireman leaned out of the other side of the cab and called out, "Come here, Jack, quick!" The driver took the fireman's place and looked back. The guard was calling to them, waving a green lantern in one arm and waving the other above his head. The men seemed confused. "He's not asking us to come back, is he?" asked the fireman. "We're out on the main line. There's nowhere else to be going. No stations, no junctions, sidings, nothing."
Perhaps one of those stations that we went rocketing through was where we were supposed to go. Come on, let's back her up.
The driver took a hold of the reverser and slowly pulled it open. Lizzie began to forge backwards, simmering and hissing quietly. It certainly was a change from the chaotic noise around her moments earlier. Seemingly out of nowhere, the line began to curve off to the left to one of the large fields. The fireman looked back quite a few times, as both he and the driver thought the guard might be having them on. But the guard kept waving his lantern and beckoning them back deeper into the fields on one solitary line. The 4300 was confused, if not suspicious. Why would there be a single track from a busy section of the main line going to where no one could see them? She'd made more trips up and down the western region than she had spokes on all 6 driving wheels, and had never seen anything like this before. It could have been built recently, but for what purpose? And why were new tracks being built when the ones they already had desperately needed replacing? As she kept trampling backwards, Lizzie tried to think of all the reasons why such a thing would exist here of all places. She didn't have to think for long.
Well, I never... Look at that!
Good Lord! Lizzie stared on in dumbfounded shock, as did her crew. It was a marshalling yard, 2 or 3 times the size of Hackney yards. Line upon line of wagons stood either side of the mogul, stretching as far as it could from one end to the other. There must have been hundreds or thousands of these wagons here. As she slowed to a stop, Lizzie could hear tank engines behind her briskly dismantling and rearranging her train. "What is this?" she muttered.
"Well, you reckon we get out with that?"
said a voice. Lizzie looked about her.
"Down there, sweetheart."
Lizzie glanced over. What the bloody hell was that? Was that a tractor? On the rails? He had buffer beams and side rods and everything! Now Lizzie really had seen it all.
"We be a rail tractor, I is. Now, this here be an arsenal's yard. This is."
He continued, drawling in a thick, twanging accent.
"Every coin of whip you can think of is here. shells, bombs, ammunition cases, gunpowder, machine guns, slingshots. We even got ourselves a few tanks and lorries here, we has.
What? Why so much in one place? What's it doing here? Lizzie wheezed after another fit of coughing.
Well, as you can see, he's like a little storage yard, isn't he? We've got the locomotives bringing them up here, and we goes off and organises them into what he's got on board. And he sits here and waits his turn to go off when he's needed. And apparently,
the thing added,
there's more yards like this one up and down country. And they's all waiting their turn to go off and join the army.
Bloody daft to have such a big stash of supplies in one place, Lizzie grunted. You say there's more like this?
Oh, you do, sweetheart.
Then they're all targets. Germans have bigger airplanes that can shoot better guns. I've seen them. What are you going to do when a massive weapon cache like this gets hit and goes up in flames?
I see that's all part of the fun.
The tractor hollered.
Them buggers ain't got a yard yet, have they? Them Jerry's are going right mad trying to find yards like this one. They managed to get themselves a yard and they'll be as happy as my driver getting a pint of scrumpy for dinner.
I don't find it funny, Lizzie said dryly. The first raid on Newton Abbot was still fresh in her mind, as well as those awful pictures that had flashed in front of her eyes.
Oh, he'll be alright, sweetheart,
the tractor said after a while. His tone was much softer, and he could tell that Lizzie seemed upset about the idea.
They ain't got 'em yet, have they? And these yards be so well hidden, I don't think they ever will. You come far?
Lizzie told him where she'd set off from, and the rail tractor made a noise, engine burbling into life and preparing to move off.
Right, I'd best bugger off home quick if I were you. Don't want to be stuck out here when they go flying by again. Not with a blockout and all. I'd offer you a tarpaulin, but I dare say my manager wouldn't thank me very much for that, would you?
Lizzie watched the shunter disappear into the hastening black.
Where be a blackbird too? I know where he be. He be up yonder old tree, and I be after me. Now I sees he, and he sees I. Buggered if I don't jam. A perfect stick all man down. Blackbird we laughy. Blackbird we laughy. La da 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 da. Oh me father! Oi!
And when she was cleared to leave, she gingerly set off for home. If she thought she could clank badly before, then by Jove she was not prepared for this noise. Any German bomber would have been able to hear her for miles around before spotting the glow of her fire on the rails. It wasn't just that she was now clanking for England. She was coughing badly every few minutes, and her cylinders ached. Every bit of Lizzie ached. It was going to take quite a while for the 4300 to limp her way home. And this was going to be a story worth telling for years to come.